Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski.
On the podcast, we're talking to someone who's the epitome of the word pioneer. From Western Pennsylvania, IUP. She started as a fierce competitor in a sport not running. She started before running was a sport at IUP for women. The adventure and life story of our guest today is fantastic, and I'm sure you're all going to enjoy meeting Marcy Schwam. Welcome.
Thank you.
Marcy, we've never met. I know you grew up loving tennis and as a fierce competitor. But let's go back just a little bit farther. Your ancestors. What's the story of your ancestors coming to America?
My father was born in Poland. So technically, I'm first generation on that side of the family because I'm the first child. Most of the town where my family's from was destroyed in the war. So as much as I try to track the history, it's unavailable because the cemetery was destroyed, the name is made up, the birth dates are made up, everything is made up, and there's literally no record of it. I had lived in Stockholm for a number of years and worked with an organization that was trying to trace ancestors, and they just couldn't do it. I've got records and things of my father and his mother on the boat that they came on. Can't really read what the name says, but by date, I know that was found. That was actually somebody doing research on ultra running that found it all. And that's almost all that I know. My mother's family as well came from Poland, but emigrated to Paris. They spent most of their adult life in Paris before coming to the U.S. They don't have a lot of recall of growing up in Poland. They spoke fluent French, and they really were more French than they were Polish Jews.
And with that history, without their information about further ancestry, were there other athletes in your family by the time you started?
No. I'm the oldest of the offspring that followed in my father's generation.
Your career's been well documented. There's lots of stories and interviews. One thing is people talking about how competitive you were, from board games to early tennis. What was your earliest memories of competition and how that fired you up?
Probably youth playing tennis in camp. I, fortunately or unfortunately, was very competitive and never wanted to lose. I was left-handed. They kept wanting to put the tennis racket in my right hand, and I was not a right-handed human being. I'm still left-handed. I think that was the thing that was the most frustrating. They just didn't want you to be a left-handed person at 5 and 6 years old. I think the competitive started there, really, with the tennis, and unfortunately carried through to this day.
You were playing against other girls at that point? There were other girls in the tennis competition then?
Yeah, you know what? I think in camp it was probably mixed. Again, early, 5, 6 years. You're talking 1958, day camp, country club camp, recreational camp. It was mixed. It wasn't just girls. And there was no tennis for girls when I went to high school. Other than recreational tennis growing up, where you did compete girls against girls, teens against teens, my first real taste of adult competition after that would have been at IUP.
How did you decide to go to IUP?
It was the only school I got into that had a phys ed major. I was not a good student.
Wow. Okay, what year did you enter IUP?
Fall of 71.
How quickly did the team rise to greatness? It's been called perhaps the best IUP team of any sport of any year.
When I started at IUP, I was actually on the satellite campus in Punxsutawney the first year. So I didn't get to play on the team until the fall of 72 when we came back and I moved from Punxsutawney to the IUP campus. I want to say it was 73 or 74 that the team had probably significant gains under Coach Mary Louise Eltz. I think it was 73.
How much did your game improve there with the college coaching? How was your coaching?
It improved a lot. I wouldn't say I'm especially strong. Being left-handed still in the 70s, there were not that many left-handed female players. I was very quick on the tennis court and I could cover a lot of ground. What I lacked in strength, I made up in speed and basically would out-endure anybody on the tennis court, I think is what it comes down to. It was definitely not from a strength factor.
How much running training were you doing to compete in tennis?
So I started running 57 years ago as a youth in the neighborhood to stay in shape for tennis and would run back and forth to the tennis courts most of the time, which were 2 miles away from where I lived growing up. Then high school sports, I was still running basically to stay in shape because my whole thing was if I can't beat you on strength or strategy, I'll out-endure you. At IUP, I really started running a lot. Unfortunately, got into the whole eating disorder thing that young runners face. That was a little bit of a demise. But the more I ran, the better I felt. So I was running quite a bit. And then I met the cross country team at IUP, and I was running with them, doing their long runs, meeting them on the weekends to run. Mileage wise, I went from recreational to being somewhat competitive in my own mind, but I was only competing with myself.
Do you remember any of the people that you were running with then?
It would have been Donnie Slusser and his good friend Jim.
Jim Lear, maybe?
Could be. I wish I could remember his last name. I tried to look back at the 1973, 74, and 75 men's cross country team at IUP to see if I could find a roster.
I'll send that to you. I can track all that down.
Jim and Don were probably my two closest friends. I ran my first race ever in Shenley Park in Pittsburgh area. I went with the guys too, and that was the first time I'd ever, I won't say heard of a race because I knew the marathon and Frank Shorter and blah, blah, blah. But it was the first time because really girls weren't allowed to run many races yet. So it was really that first cross country race in Shenley Park. I think it was Liberty Track Club at the time. That coach asked me if I wanted to run other races with them. And I did do some. I don't remember like where they were. They were out in the Pittsburgh area when I could get to it from Indiana. But that was really my first taste of running in a race. My mind in 72, 73, 74, 75 was still set on playing professional tennis. I had no interest in being a runner.
How was your experience in the race? Do you remember how it felt to
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it. It was too short for me, but I loved it. Absolutely thought it was like just the best thing I'd ever done.
Before we talk about you becoming then a runner in your mind and psyche, let's talk about what happened with your tennis career after you left IUP and your consideration of going pro with that.
I had the opportunity my senior year at IUP. It was probably late winter of 75. I had the opportunity to play on a satellite tour for the Virginia Slims down in Brownsville, Texas. I'd gotten invited, or I applied, and my college record at that point allowed me to go. And I went. We stayed with families down in Brownsville, right on the border, the Rio Grande border. The tennis courts were like a carpet, not something I was familiar with outdoor. I never played on that kind of a surface. Unfortunately, the whole tennis scene of very, very wealthy, obnoxious, all white women playing tennis and brought up at country clubs and tennis lessons. I was a raw tennis player. I was a street tennis player, to put it bluntly. Turned me off. I was still, we are the world. This is just too material for me. I'm just not one of you. I'm not a country club kid. I don't have a tennis court in my backyard. I grew up in an apartment. I came home and I was like, can I say shit? I was like, crap, what am I going to do? That's the thing I thought for sure that was going to be my life stream was just not me outside of the tennis court itself. So when I graduated college, I played for a couple of summers recreationally. I got a job teaching tennis. I was still very active in tennis, but I was starting to look at my master's in exercise science, and I became fascinated with endurance. And from there, a lot of my energy shifted. Even though I was still playing tennis a lot, from a competitive standpoint, my energies really shifted towards looking at running and endurance.
And when was the first longer race that you ran?
The first longer race I ran was either 1976 or 1977, a 50-kilometer in Central Park. After that, it was the Forest Hills 40-miler in Queens, New York. Probably, again, I'll say 77.
What was the community like? Did you see the same people at both of those races? And
Yes.
how big was it? And how many other women were you meeting?
In the 40-miler, I think I might have been the only one. I honestly don't remember, but we were few and far between. The New York ultra running scene, it was pretty much the same group that showed up to, it was like Rich Innamorato out of Brooklyn. It was Forest Hills, the Knickerbocker 60K. There were a couple of races, and these were all on road at the time, or park loops. But you saw the same people at all of them. I'm not sure if there were any women, if there were one or two of us.
So the running boom had started, technically.
Yes.
But with Frank Shorter's kind of landmark.
And that was really, I think that's what started it.
So these races you were going to, what was the administration? Were there numbers? Were there water stops? Was there any money?
No money, no anything. At the time, the AAU did not allow any. Running was amateur. There was no running unless you were truly track and field at that Olympic level. And even then, if you think about it, the Olympians weren't allowed to be sponsored. It was strictly amateur. Yes, there were race numbers. Scoring was very archaic on a clipboard with popsicle sticks. Entry fees were very nominal. And there were water stops.
Yeah.
And it was pretty much only water because, again, you know what? Defized Coke was the drink of choice.
What about prizes? Medals, trophies, T-shirts, anything? Do you remember? What's your earliest collection from?
I think, you know what? Some of the events did have either medals or trophies. About 3 years ago, I went through everything I had, sorted through it, closed my eyes, and took 99.99% of it to the dump because I was like, what am I going to do with all this? I can barely remember. It's wonderful to look at. I went through down memory lane by myself in the basement, and I kept a few things that were very special, and everything else I got rid of.
When did it occur to you that you were going to challenge for records? You had no less than 6 world records, a wide assortment over distances and times. When did that enter your race preparation and goal setting?
In 1978, decided that with a friend that we were going to move from New York to San Francisco area and work in a running shoe store and be runners. We trained together. We got in very closely with the San Francisco running crowd. And on the way, after running 2 or 3, maybe 4 ultras in New York and deciding this is the direction that I'm going in, I ran Pikes Peak Marathon on the way driving out to San Francisco. I think it was really that rude awakening of this is definitely something that you're built for. In 1978, they had the run around Lake Tahoe, and no woman had ever completed it. I think that was absolutely the start. That was mentally where it was like, okay, you just became the first woman to run around Lake Tahoe, and you came in 10th of everybody. And okay, what do we do from here?
Yeah. How did you decide what you would do from there?
I made a lot of bad choices. I guess it depends. I dropped having a career. I dropped having any kind of true financial stability. I wanted to run, and I wanted to be the first, and I wanted to prove that women could do long distance events almost equally as well as the men. We weren't going to lose our uterus. We weren't going to have all these horrible things happen to us that it was believed at the time was going to happen. I became friends with Dr. Joan Uliet, who wrote the first woman's running book. She was a Bay Area pioneer as well, highly recognized for all of her information about women's running. I was also actually going for my master's in exercise science at San Francisco State and became fascinated with endurance. I was used as a guinea pig in our own classes. When I learned more about myself, my own makeup of what I was capable of doing, I think that was really what spurred a lot of it on.
I'd like to talk about your training, but let me just throw a random story in that I've heard. Of course, by then, the marathons were open to women. Boston Marathon, the blue card story. What's that?
So
The blue card. Yeah.
at IUP, if you remember the soccer coach,
Vince
yes,
Seltniks. Yes.
Feltniks. So when I became friends with the cross country boys, and he saw me running with them all the time because he ran with us as well, he had pulled me aside and he said, what do you think about running the Boston Marathon? And I said, okay. He said, the boys are going, blah, 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 blah. I researched a little more about the Boston Marathon, and I was like, okay. I went with the boys. I entered Boston. I should say the boys entered me in Boston. They showed me how to enter, what I needed to do, got into Boston. We drove to first New York. We stayed on my parents' floor in their apartment. Then we all stayed in a room at a Holiday Inn in Boston. I think there were 5 of us at the time. I didn't care that I was the only girl. It didn't matter to me. When we went to number pickup, you used to get mailed a blue card if you were a male and a pink card if you were female. Because there were so few females, running and I was a total unknown, they left the Y off my name and I got a blue card with the name Mark. So when I went out to Hopkinton to pick up my number, they wouldn't let me get a number. I showed ID, everything. So I actually had to go into the men's gym with the half-naked men, show that I have this blue card. It was sent in error. You made the mistake, not me. At the time, Gloria Ratty, who was responsible for women's running in New England and the Boston Marathon, she came to my rescue and she got me a correct number. It was F12. And that was that. I went the next day and ran Boston very poorly. To be quite honest with you, I don't even know if it was ever completely recorded. I saw it in one result. Along the way, the last 5 miles or so, I came across some guy who was just struggling with leg cramps. And being naive and interested in exercise science, I stopped with him and tried to help him. And I said, you know what? We'll just go together from here. And we did. And it was upper 4 hours and something. White tube socks, Adidas, leather, country, running shoes, dolphin shorts that didn't fit women at the time. If I look now, it's God, that was a cluster F. But
Right.
lesson learned.
Let's go back to the West Coast. You're studying the science of endurance. You're learning a lot about your own physiology and capabilities. How much were you training?
At that point, I was probably training 120-mile weeks, 120 to 140. I got in with a lot of the long distance Bay Area and Sacramento runners that would go run up on the Western States course or run up in that area, a 50-mile with somebody driving with aid, running on the San Francisco polo fields. I was definitely up over that 120 to 140-mile training weeks. Every weekend was absolutely dedicated to a multi-hour run, sometimes from sun up to sundown, and running twice a day midweek.
Had you completely overcome the eating issues that you had earlier by then?
I'm 70. I still haven't overcome it.
Okay. What about in other injuries through that early part of your career?
Early part, I was very fortunate. I really abused myself and remained injury-free up until nagging Achilles and up until a knee, which I don't even think was running related. I think it was more CrossFit,
Wow.
maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah. Let's talk about the competition and how it was with your rivals. Sometimes you would set a record and find out someone had beaten the record on the same day in another part of the world. How did you feel about that competition and how well did you know the other women who were in that same pioneering era of you of accomplishment in ultra running?
What was very interesting about that period of time, late 70s to mid 80s, was everybody was vying for the same spot, the same recognition. But most of us never got to compete in the same event with each other. There were some. I remember Lake Warramug, Leslie Watson from the UK. We were both going for 50-mile record at the time. Sandra Kitty and I. Most of us, because we lived in so many different places, we really didn't get to compete against each other. So we ran different events for the most part. We were very aware of everybody's accomplishments and what it took to one up the next person. If I look at interviews or I look at articles from way back, I think it was very cordial. Again, it was a small kind of eclectic group of women all trying to accomplish the same thing. Each of us in our respective locales had our own following, if you will, or we ran the same races with the same guys in our respective places of residence. We really didn't have an opportunity to compete against each other. There was some, but it was a little bit later on.
It's very individualized. What about coaching? Did you have any formal arrangement with coaches?
No. Here and there for the teams that I ran on, I would say that the somewhat endurance speed that I developed, I think came from my time in New York with Bob Glover and Atalanta, which was pretty much the premier New York running club for women at the time. But outside of that, I would say that I knew me best and no one was going to tell me what to do.
That's great. When did sponsorship deals and your arrangements with that and funding come in?
So there still really wasn't funding. I was a Nike athlete early on. The New York team that I ran with ended up being a Nike sponsored team again at the time. But in terms of funding, there was none. I did get free footwear and apparel. There was no travel unless the race organizer, wherever it might have been, provided you with assistance. There still really wasn't any per se sponsorship or funding other than footwear and apparel.
Let's talk about one race director, a very famous guy who's gone now, Fred LeBeau, of course, a race director, New York City Marathon, New York Road Running Club, and I think he organized some ultra events. How well did you know Fred?
Good friend. Good, very good friend. Because when I came back to New York for a short stint after college, I worked at the New York Road Runners Club. I actually got to ride the first blue line for the New York City Marathon course with Fred. So I would see Fred every day. We were good friends. I visited him 48 hours before he passed away. So I knew him quite well and saw him daily.
I was in Cairo. That trip he made over with, he had 4 runners with him, and I had been an athlete, so I jumped in and I ran the marathon. Marie Francis was the race director. She was going to do exotic marathons. And I remember going to the wrap-up meeting and Fred said, "Don't do this again."
Yeah.
And it wasn't long after that, I think, that he got his cancer.
And it was also interesting at the time because Fred is of Jewish descent and just going to Cairo was unheard of at the
Right.
time.
Yeah. Yeah. I have some photos. I probably should figure it out and ask you if you knew who these were. There weren't any elite runners who brought with him. He just brought a handful of people who were going to run the course. Were there more obstacles? Fairly early on, you established yourself as an elite runner. So I assume that people respected that in general. Race directors wanted you at their races. What other hurdles were there apart from just navigating this fringe niche activity with limited funding?
I think it was, again, events were much smaller. There were certainly not anything like it is today with an ultra, practically every day of the week. So it was very different. And you also tended to see some of the same people at different events. Those that ran predominantly 24-hour or 48-hour track events there was the West Coast contingent and the East Coast contingent for the most part, and then that Ohio group in the middle. It was different abroad because women were not really doing ultras in Europe yet. There were some, mostly track events. But in terms of some of the other events, depending upon what country you ran in, if you did well, it was questioned, were you really female or not? Other than that, it really was fine. Unfortunately, again, because you were pretty much traveling by yourself, you were left to your own vices of figuring out how to get from point A to point B and taking care of yourself. It wasn't like you were coddled to for the most part.
You had a cerebral, somewhat approach to all this studying. Your sense of pace, you've run records both on track and on trail and on hills. How keenly aware and how precise were you aware of pace of running in some of these extremely long races?
Very aware. Very aware. If I was setting my goal on something specific, I would basically know what I would have to do at each milestone or interval along the way to hit that ultimate goal. Sometimes successful and plenty of failures along the way too. But I would say I knew pacing pretty well. Even today, as an old slow lady, if I tell you I'm going to be at the top of the mountain at 10 o'clock, guarantee you between 9:55 and 5 after 10, I'm going to be at the top of the mountain. So even now, a little broken and a little shuffle, I still know where I'm at and how to get there.
That's great. Let's talk about when you were at your peak of performance. How did you handle not accomplishing your goal and what you called as plenty of failures? How did you deal with those?
Aside from the temper tantrum,
Right. Yeah, the temper tantrum is probably good enough to leave it there. But yes, how did you process it?
I think you beat yourself up. What should you have done? What could you have done to avoid the failure, if you will? And then you immediately look at, okay, how do you redeem yourself? What's next? And what are you going to do? What are you going to do differently? You dwell on it for a little while and you figure out what went wrong. And then you make another attempt at how to do it better and correct what it might be.
In most races, it sounds like you were running towards a goal or a time. You weren't running towards a place in the race. So there were few women. You tended not to be competing against the other most elite women at any particular race. You wouldn't all be in there together. Is that the case?
For me, it was more about the time. If there were a few other women in the race, I was still focused on the time and less about the competition. Again, that changed as more women started entering ultras and entering trail marathons and being just as competitive as I was. But early on, I think it was looking at times to beat versus people.
Right. I think it was in the early 80s, you were voted and honored as Ultra Marathoner of the Year
Yep.
for running, by Sports Illustrated. What did those mean to you? And were you aware that was coming, that kind of honor?
No, for some of them, and yes, for some, because some they would contact you. When it was Sports Illustrated, yes, that Faces in the Crowd thing, I did know about that. Ultra running, no, I didn't those 2 years. Ultra Running Hall of Fame, no, that year. IUP, yes, because they sent you the invite to come. I think in most cases, no, right up until the last moment.
You've had such a long career. You've talked about disposing of the memorabilia. Is there a top 3 or a top 5 of races or honors that you remember fondly?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I'm very humble. Yes, I can speak and I can laugh about everything, but I never really liked tension. So I shied away from it. Even today, running to me, I say that's my life, which is pathetic, but it's me. I think looking back at events, setting the 50-mile world record, I think will always stand out to me as like the best effort because it was so difficult to do. I trained specifically for that. The logistics that were involved, what the race directors helped with to make it possible from keeping people out of the way and having the proper authorities at the finish line to certify it. That was probably one of the all-time greats. The Spartathlon in Greece was just an amazing experience. And all three American women, we ran together for 34 hours. So that, again, was something that was very unique. I think the 100K in Santander, Spain, coming in third, setting a record there, being questioned by the Italian men, whether I was male or female, doing my acceptance in Spanish. That was probably, again, another one that was very, very special. They all have a little bit of something to them, but I think those are probably some of the bigger standouts that were a little bit more unique and that I trained specifically for. When I set the 100-mile record on the track, that was on the way to a 24-hour. So that intent was not there. That intent was just going out like a crazy lady and staying crazy for 15 hours and 44 minutes. But those are probably some of the standouts. And I'm fortunate that I got to experience racing in a number of different places, got to do so many things, both at the height of my career and since then, just age group type acknowledgments as well.
You said, I say running is my life, but you've had quite a life and your activities picking up again a career with your advanced education and then your career and living around the world. Where else have you lived and what else have you done?
So I lived on the West Coast in San Francisco and a little stint up at Lake Tahoe. I lived in Stockholm for 5 years. And then really New York and New England are probably the rest. Where I live now is the longest I've ever been in one place.
What were you doing in Stockholm?
Stockholm, when I first went, I was a country manager for Federal Express. When Federal Express turned their business in that part of Europe back over to using an agent, I worked as import manager for UPS. So a whole different industry, and you're going to say, how the heck did you get into that? And again, it was one of those fascinations. I read all about Federal Express and how Fred Smith had this worldwide, you can get a letter the next day. And I was a courier at night in Massachusetts where I lived and went over to run the Stockholm Marathon and saw that Federal Express was hiring. And I went and I applied and they were like, you're from the US, you know more about this than we do. I went over and within a month I was given the country.
Also, what about activities and the parts of your career that related to sports and running? Did you work with Saucony?
Saucony, I'm still involved with as a trail ambassador and do consulting, and I've been involved with them for the last couple of years, actually, number of years. I worked for Reebok for 15 years in product and product marketing. Prior to that, I was involved in women's sports marketing for a number of years. So I've used kind of sport and running and footwear as my more recent career.
Let's talk about that women's sports marketing. Was that for business? At some point, did you feel like you were an advocate for women's sports?
My business partner, Sharon Barbano, was also a very good New York runner. And we had different skills. I had the exercise science background. Sharon has the fluff and the marketing and the writing and the presentation skills. Many companies were using women's sport, or in particular women's running, in the mid-'80s to promote their product. Lean Cuisine, Boboli, Tufts Health Plan, the New York Roadrunners Club, Legs Mini Marathon, corporate challenge. There were just so many. And we bidded on contracts to do the product launches for them. I'm going to say 83. I could be off by a year. Hasbro had a toy out. It was called Get in Shape Girl. We did all of the choreography and programming for that toy. We had a nice bid with Hasbro and a 2-year stint of developing this fitness toy for girls.
Right.
So we did a lot of that. We were both still Nike athletes. So we did different clinics for beginning running, Freihofer's up in Albany. When that fitness boom for women started in the 80s, there was really a lot of opportunity if you knew how to package yourself and do it.
There were obviously barriers as a pioneer, as sometimes the only female at a race or one of a handful doing something. What about that in the corporate world as you grew up in it in the 70s, 80s, and onward?
It
See,
never changed.
yeah.
It never changed. It still hasn't changed today, unfortunately. Granted, there are more female presidents of athletic footwear companies, but we're judged way differently than the men are in corporate America when it comes to sport. And I don't even care what sport. It's still definitely a male-dominated game, even if it's just by attitude.
When we're talking about running, especially ultra, the clock doesn't lie. So your performance there is not really a matter of subjectiveness. Objectively, you did what you did, and you're a plain talker.
It's yes.
Let me ask you about some of the men. There are a few elite men who got more fame during that period. Were you seeing those characters at the races too? Some of the men who were setting parallel records to the ones you were setting?
Yes, but it didn't bother me. I wasn't interested in fame. If I went home at night and knew I did what I did, I was the only one I cared about. It just didn't matter to me. There've been a lot of critics. You should have done this. You should have done that. This guy's making a name for himself and he's no different than you are. I didn't care. I wasn't interested in that. I just didn't mean anything to me.
It's crazy healthy. I know we all have challenges. You talked about your own challenges with food and, of course, failures and missing goals along the way, but you have a great healthy attitude. Is that recent? You're smiling as you look through all this now. Is that recent? Or
I think there's bits and pieces. You can't go backwards. So what you've done, a lot of it is history. I would love to be in my 40s now, knowing what I know and having all of the opportunities to run so many wonderful events. We didn't have hydration belts. We didn't have adventure vests. You shook up a bottle of Coke and you let it spew out and you drank the sludge that was left from it mixed with a little water and ate salted pretzels. There were no energy replacement things. There was nothing, even footwear. If you look at footwear from old photos, there was no footwear. There was no apparel for women. There were no jog bras. None of this stuff existed. I would love to have those advantages now. Also knowing some of the things that we've learned about hydration and nutrition over the years of there being enough of the population to talk to, sample, look at performances. There are so many wonderful things now that weren't available and so many different kinds of events that really didn't exist 40 years ago. I would love to be able to start all over again. That's not happening. Not going to go backwards. You move on. I'm very active still with trail running. The distances are shorter. I still have a 24-hour that I'm doing in the fall. I love the mountain races. It's like I say, at 70, if I know how to get back to where I started, that's fine.
are they keeping records for the ultra distances by age group? Are there 70 and over age group?
They do, and I have a couple of aspirations for one or two that are out there and I think obtainable.
One thing that runners mentioned from the era is the part of running that many people weren't aware of was rest. Equipment, nutrition, weight training, a lot of things. What about rest? Was that something that you think was,
Never.
would it have mattered to you, or were you indestructible?
It's hard to say. That could be one of those definite mistakes that was not something that was talked about as much as it is now. And if you look at a lot of the upcoming runners that are doing so extremely well, they don't run high mileage weeks. They do perhaps a long run and they rest. They also multi-sport. There's a lot more cross training. There's a lot more focus on rest and recovery. I think, again, going back 40-ish years, it was mileage, 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 mileage. You want to be an endurance runner, you run. End of discussion. You don't rest, you run. You want to be a Birkie skier in Norway, you ski. And you train off sport, you train on your roller skis. I think that was really the attitude back then. If you talk to, as you do, long distance runners from the 70s and 80s, we all did the same thing. It was the belief, Lydiard's long, slow distance. You ran, you walked, you ran, you walked, you ran, you walked. You did it until the cows came home. And that was how you trained. Rest didn't exist.
There's a handful of people who say the more I ran, the better I got, but they're certainly the rare exception.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it was the belief. And I think part of it was even our own competitiveness with our comrades. It was, if you knew Susie Q was running 140 miles a week and she was doing so well, okay, you're going to run 160 miles a week and you're going to do better. So I think the group was small enough that you knew how we were all doing the same thing. We were running ridiculous miles and back-to-back weekends. You'd run to Kingdom Come and then you'd run back the next day. It was just how it was.
You've got a great way of telling your stories. With the publication of this, I'll put a link to a lot of the interviews and articles and videos there are about you. I really encourage people to read about it. It's a fascinating story of the time, following your career through those things. It's amazing. When's the last time you picked up a tennis racket?
It has been at least 18 years.
Wow.
And do I miss it? Absolutely. And if people ask me, how come you haven't gotten into pickleball? And,
Yeah.
and to be quite honest, I probably will. My left shoulder isn't the greatest. And after I broke my collarbone last year, it's even less great. It hasn't been an interest, but it's everywhere around me. And not a day goes by that somebody doesn't ask me about pickleball.
Yeah, that might be career number 5 ahead. Yeah.
Career 5, pickleball.
Yeah. Is there anything else you think you want to mention in this? I think it's just been great.
I think what is unfortunate is so much from the late 70s, mid 70s to Joan Benoit's winning the Los Angeles Marathon
Right.
is so different than what that brought forward. Joan winning in 84 is the same as Frank Shorter winning in 72. And women jumped on that in 84, just like running enthusiasts jumped on long distance running in 72 after Frank Shorter. But the years in between from 72 to 84 are a whole chapter of running that the up and coming are not necessarily aware of. Many are, but many are not.
That's why it's great to get another interview with you. Many you've done, but again, like this, of interest to the runners who were also not part of the ultra community. That's another niche that puts you even more pioneer positioned.
That was very different. I think in 76, 77, I probably ran a marathon a month in different parts of the country before really learning more about the availability of ultras and moving from road to more tolerable surfaces of trail. I still love the concept of 24 hours on a track, controlled, going around in circles, staying up all night, going through those midnight hallucinations. That experience is still very, very unique.
In Cairo, we did a 12-hour relay. So I have one little tiny bit of experience there where I did an overnight 12, but I was running 1 mile, trying to run a 520 mile, go to sleep for 55 minutes and get up. Even that, I can relate to the middle of the night hallucinations and bizarreness of it. So staying alert and on pace for those ultra distance runners puts you in a very small class of people that have gone through that.
Yeah,
Very-
it's definitely, it's different, but memorable.
I haven't talked to Donnie Slusser yet. He and his wife, they have logged everything. So they have together run more than 300,000 miles. So they're coming back from the moon. I wonder how many miles you think you've run.
I tried to figure it out a few years ago because I used to keep track, but I dumped all that too because it was like, who cares about it except for me? I know that many years ago I did hit that 100K mark, just estimating where I am today and the decrease in mileage from the big mileage. So right now it's probably in that 120,000 arena.
Yeah.
We'll see where it ends up.
Halfway to the moon now.
Halfway to the moon.
It's great. Thanks for taking the time, Marcy.
Absolutely.
I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.